Episode 23, the 28th of September, 1998. It's now late September, and at the pace I've set with all I have to do for a late summer opening, I'm in for it. What isn't planted in the next month or so will not be worth planting, for this season at least. It's still possible that I'll achieve my goal, but only with a much bigger time commitment than I've made so far. The plants have been doing their thing. I have pots and pots of Narcissus cyclaminius that have flowered prolifically, all grown from seed. It is perhaps the most distinctive, certainly the most curious species of daffodil, and it was lost to cultivation for so long that there were serious doubts about it ever having existed, the drawings of it being considered so absurd and so unlikely. Then it was rediscovered in Portugal in the 19th century, but has always been scarce in the nursery trade. That's probably because it's slow to divide, though it's very easy from fresh seed. Being brought up in a family which wouldn't call in a tradesperson or repair person until it could not possibly be avoided, where necessary expenses made a very short list indeed, I've not yet grown comfortable enough parting with money to buy the numbers of bulbs I long for. It's simply a question of priority. I know of people who travel widely and drive smart cars but would consider a bag of bulbs to be an extravagance. I know still more who are kept seriously poor by their passion for plants. Anyway, a simple matter of priority or not, I know that the only way I'll ever have good quantity of bulbs is to grow my own from seed. Named varieties won't come true since seed production always results in genetic recombination, but most straight species are sufficiently stable that their offspring will be virtually identical to the parent. I usually use a 6-inch pot, still called that though pot sizes went metric years ago. This one is 15 centimetres, as I normally have heaps of them lying around. They also dry out more slowly than anything shallower and are deep enough for long roots to travel down. As this will be the home of the tiny bulbs for 3 or more years, that's quite important. The pots need to be filled near to the top with a good quality potting mix. Some of the cheaper ones are downright lethal to plants, which needs to be pressed down reasonably firmly so that the water won't settle it unevenly. The seeds are then scattered on the surface, then covered with a few more millimetres of potting mix. I then cover this, in turn, with a few millimetres of either coarse sand or 5mm screenings. This helps keep the surface moist, but more importantly, helps to keep moss and lichen from growing on the surface. The density of seed sowing is another consideration. More often than not, I have had only small quantities of each type of seed, so one 6-inch pot was plenty. On the odd occasion I've had so much of one type of seed, and not being able to bear to throw any away, have sown the pots too thickly. It rarely works out to advantage. You may as well have thrown the seed away as to sow it too thickly. In one particular case I remember, dealing with the fabulous and horrendously rare Eremurus himalaicus, which is a foxtail lily, the seed germinated like lawn, but there was a steady decline in the number of seedlings over the next 3 years or so, probably due to overcrowding. I wound up with only a fraction of the seeds growing to maturity. Anyway, once sown, the pots then receive a good watering, then are placed in a shady spot where I'll remember to water them regularly for the next 2 or 3 years. I learned through bitter experience not to place the pots beneath a tree or under the drip line of eaves, where large, heavy drops of water will soon burrow into the mix so that seeds or young plants are lost. Young plants might appear quite soon or take a year or so. Sometimes they take several years, but this is more the exception than the rule. Once the plants appear, it's well worth feeding them on a regular basis with a soluble fertiliser, if you remember. I seldom do. I mention that to show that this is not rocket science. While there is probably a right way to do it, plants are generally pretty forgiving, and bulb seed generally has a strong will to live and grow. A legendary old couple who lived in the Dandenongs and grew fabulous things from seed never fed them. Then they observed how much sooner younger members of their gardening society were getting plants to flowering size, and eventually, though a little reluctantly, began to feed. They couldn't believe the improvement, which also goes to show that no matter how long you've been gardening, you'll be constantly surprised by stuff you learn from other gardeners, and often beginner gardeners. Anyway, after 2 or 3 years, you'll need to move the young plants to a larger pot or into the garden. They're best teased out to give them some more room, and this can be done at pretty much any time of year, though you'll minimise your losses if this is done just before they kick into growth or during the first few weeks of growth. Plants that are susceptible to rot when roots are damaged will generally repair themselves most rapidly if the damage is sustained during active growth. Growing bulbs from seed sometimes produces surprising results. For instance, flowering beautifully this year is my own spontaneous hybrid of Narcissus cyclamineus, named after my eldest daughter Evangeline, as it was flowering for the first time when she came home from hospital as a newborn. It's probably twice the size of the species in all its parts, and the petals don't reflex nearly so much. Though growing in a much more sunny position than in other years, the petals have reflexed more, to the detriment of its beauty. I thought I was sowing the straight species, but obviously it had found a new partner, and several hybrids were the result. I have a passion for Narcissus cyclamineus and virtually any of its hybrids. Narcissus Jenny, planted in autumn, is now in full bloom and has been for weeks. It is to me the most perfect of daffodils. I've so far resisted Narcissus Jetfire, as its orange trumpet looks gaudy in the catalogues, but the real thing coming, as it does, at the end of a long, cold and colourless winter is delightful. And these are but two of the commercially available and reasonably cheap hybrids. The choicer ones are simply to die for.